During the early years of the war, the sky over Europe had an owner. And it wasn't God. It was the Iron Eagle flying over Germany. From the coasts of the Atlantic to the mountains of the Caucasus, the roar of German engines had become the soundtrack of fear. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, with its slim frame and piercing growl, was the terror of the skies. The Focke-Wulf 190, stronger, faster, completed the rain above the clouds. Cities burned. Convoys were torn apart, and German pilots flew with an almost divine confidence. They were young, arrogant, proud. They believed they had been born to rule the heavens. And perhaps for a time they did. Wir beherrschen den Himmel. We rule the sky. That was the phrase whispered by instructors in the Luftwaffe flight academies as cadets looked toward the horizon with confident smiles, never imagining that their own pride would be the first thing to fall. The Allies looked up with frustration. Their bombers were hunted one by one, like slow-moving prey. Their fighters, in many cases, couldn't even reach combat altitude. For the Germans, air combat was an elegant game, a deadly dance where only they set the rhythm. In 1942, the European sky was a chessboard controlled by the Reich. And across that board, German pilots moved with a clockwork precision. Each mission was a choreography of pride and superiority. They knew their machines were lighter, their maneuvers sharper, their training unmatched. The Allies, in comparison, seemed clumsy, slow, uncoordinated. From above, German pilots looked down at the British and Americans. With something more than contempt, they looked at them with pity. "Look at them, Hans," one pilot said to another as they turned over the English Channel. "They still think numbers will win the sky. They don't understand the heavens aren't conquered by masses, but by perfection." And, for a time, they were right. The Messerschmitt 109 had become a living legend. Its Daimler-Benz engine, its precise aerodynamics, its ability to climb higher and faster than any enemy made it the symbol of German air dominance. Meanwhile, the Focke-Wulf 190 perfected the art of low-level attack, striking bombers with surgical precision. Every Luftwaffe pilot felt part of an elitian aristocracy of the air that saw war not as a tragedy, but as an art form. But in the halls of high command, something began to trouble the engineers. Reports spoke of a new aircraft being developed across the Atlantic, a strange model, too big, too heavy, it barely looked like a fighter. Rumor said it burned more fuel than a base could store. A mistake, they said. Another American failure. A metal monster doomed never to fly. The engineers laughed. The pilots laughed. Even the strategists laughed. The sky isn't conquered by brute force, they said. It's conquered by elegance. And their pride kept growing, fed by every victory. Every sunken convoy, every enemy plane turned to smoke over the fields of France. But in the history of war, every arrogance meets its breaking point. One day, without warning, the familiar roar was no longer alone in the air. Something new appeared on the horizon, something no one expected. That dawn in 1943, a German pilot would later recall, we heard a different sound. Deep, harsh. It wasn't from our engines, nor from the British Spitfires. It was something else. A roar coming from the west. We didn't know what it was. Only that, after that day, the sky was no longer ours. And that was the beginning of the story of the plane that would forever change the course of air warfare, the Thunderbolt. The metal thunder the Germans once mocked, but soon would fear, as it shook the pride of the German sky. Thousands of miles from the front lines, deep inside factories that never slept, a new creature was taking shape. It wasn't born from the mind of a lone genius, but from the hands of thousands of unknown workers, engineers, mechanics, and women who had left their homes to fill the void the war had left behind. The United States wasn't just building a plane. It was forging a symbol. The design was a gamble. A plane so large that some said it would never leave the ground. So heavy that the numbers showed it would sink into the runway before ever reaching takeoff speed. But General Alexander Seversky and the engineers at Republic Aviation thought differently. If the enemy ruled the sky through speed and agility, then the sky had to be conquered with power and endurance. And so, the P-47 Thunderbolt was born a giant with wings. Its heart was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial monster, capable of roaring with over 2,000 horsepower. Its body was wide, solid, almost absurdly bulky, more like a downsized bomber than a fighter. When the first pilots saw it, they couldn't help but laugh. "Is this thing supposed to fly?" one of them joked. "This isn't a fighter, it's a bathtub with wings." Even within the Allied forces, skepticism was everywhere. Pilots of the 56th Squadron said flying the Thunderbolt was like dragging a bull tied to a comet's tail. It was heavy, slow to lift off, and thirsty for fuel. Every mission felt like a battle against physics itself. But what no one knew back then was that inside that colossal frame hid a force that would rewrite the rules of air combat. The Thunderbolt didn't need to be elegant. It needed to be indestructible. Where other fighters snapped in half under enemy fire, the P-47 barely shuddered. Its steel frame was so thick that bullets seemed to lose their strength upon hitting it. Mechanics said you could fire a machine gun point blank at its body, and it would only answer with a metallic echo as if the plane itself were laughing. It was a beast with flaming teeth. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted on each wing, capable of spitting more than 3,000 rounds per minute. 1 second of fire was enough to erase an enemy from the sky. And though the German pilots didn't know it yet, that single second would soon turn their arrogance into fear. "Don't call it a plane," an engineer said. "Call it thunder." The very weight that was once mocked soon became its greatest advantage. In a dive, the Thunderbolt reached speeds no enemy fighter could match. And while the Germans watched their Focke-Wulfs shake, trying desperately to escape, the American monster descended, like a hammer from the gods. But before it became legend, it had to survive its own flaws. At first, the pilots hated it. During training flights, the engine overheated. Fuel consumption was absurd, and its weight made it hard to handle in close combat. Some said a Spitfire could circle around a P-47 3 times before it could even aim its nose. Even so, reports from testing sites revealed something strange. Every Thunderbolt that returned from battle came home with more bullet holes than any aircraft should be able to survive. And yet, it kept flying. technicians started keeping count. One Thunderbolt landed with half a wing missing. Another returned with its landing gear destroyed and its fuel tank pierced. And one, the most famous of all, came back with over 200 bullet holes. The pilot climbed out of the cockpit, drenched in sweat, looked at the shattered fuselage, and said, "I didn't fly it. It flew for me." The rumor spread fast. Allies who once mocked it began to speak its name with respect. They called it the Juggernaut, because it looked heavy, clumsy, but it simply couldn't be broken. The Germans didn't know it yet, but in the hangars of the West, a new sound was being born, a sound that would soon echo over the fields of France. The roar of thunder. The day that sound crossed the channel for the first time, German radar operators noticed it immediately. The echo was stronger, denser, deeper than any plane before it. No one recognized it. They thought it was a mistake. They didn't realize they were hearing the beginning of the end. When the Thunderbolt rose into the sky, an American pilot would later say, "It fell as if the earth itself had learned how to fly." April 15th, 1943. Dawn broke over northern France like any other morning. The air was still and sharp. Farmers looked up at the sky, already used to the daily thunder of engines. But that morning, something felt different. A deeper sound echoed above them, heavier, denser, as if the sky itself was about to explode. 8,000 meters higher, two groups of fighters were getting ready to meet. To the east, the proud and confident Focke-Wulf 190s of the Luftwaffe. Disciplined, precise, an army that had learned how to win. To the west, the newcomers. A squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts, pilots who barely knew their own machines. Young men, some with less than 20 missions, flying planes that felt more like beasts than tools. No one among them knew they were about to write the first chapter of a legend. Thunder lead to all jugs. Form diamond and hold altitude, ordered Captain James Goodson from his cockpit. His voice trembled through the static. Behind him, the engine roared like an impatient animal. On another frequency, the Germans had already spotted them. "They're coming," said Commander Dieter Schultz. The new American fighters, slow, big, they look like fat ducks. This will be easy training. The squadrons closed in with clockwork precision. The morning sun reflected off the metal wings, filling the sky with flashes, blades of light ready to collide. The Focke-Wulfs dived first. Their classic maneuver, strike from above, fast and unseen. The Thunderbolts saw them coming, but didn't break formation. At first glance, it looked like they couldn't. "They're coming from the sun," shouted one American pilot. "Don't lose them. Hold the line. Hold the line." The first impact was devastating. German rounds tore through a Thunderbolt's wings, sparks and smoke bursting from the fuselage. But the plane didn't fall. It kept flying. A second later, still there. A third, and still there. "They're not going down," screamed Commander Schultz. "Not going down." At that moment, Captain Goodson pulled the trigger. 8 Browning .50S Spitfire. The air filled with thunder, a storm of sound that split the heavens in two. One Focke-Wulf exploded in flames. Another tried to roll away, but a burst ripped through its right wing, sending it spinning into the clouds. Black smoke began to stain the horizon. The Germans, used to watching their enemies fall in seconds, couldn't understand what was happening. For the first time, they were the ones at a disadvantage. Their bullets bounced off. Their maneuvers failed. And the Americans, clumsy just minutes earlier, now dived with unstoppable fury. The sky turned into chaos. Flight paths crossing, engines howling at the limit, voices shouting through oxygen masks, shell casings raining down like metal rain. Fall back, Dieter," one German pilot cried. "Those demons just won't die." But the Thunderbolt wasn't just surviving. It was hunting. Each dive brought a torrent of fire. 8 machine guns turned the sky into a storm of lead. The Focke Wolfs, lighter and faster, tried to dodge, but a single mistake, a single slow turn, ended in a burst that erased them from sight. "This isn't a fighter," a German pilot later wrote in his report. "It's a flying fortress disguised as a plane." In less than 6 minutes, the fight was over. 4 Thunderbolts limped home damaged, but flying. 5 German fighters lay broken across the French fields. The mechanics who received the P-47s couldn't believe what they saw. The fuselages were filled with holes, the wings scorched, the cockpits blackened with smoke. And yet every single plane had landed on its own. Captain Goodson stepped out of his aircraft, he removed his oxygen mask, and said quietly, as if speaking to no one, "Now the sky knows our name." In the days that followed, German pilots began asking questions. What are those new planes? How much armor do they have? Why do they keep flying after being hit? The intelligence reports were short and cold. New Allied aircraft, extremely durable, heavy armament, unknown capabilities, growing threat. And with that, the myth was born. The Thunderbolt had earned its name. It wasn't just a plane, it was thunder made of steel. "On the day we first saw them," a German pilot recalled years later, "we didn't understand what was happening. We were used to being the hunters. But that morning, for the first time in the entire war, the sky looked down on us as prey." In the hangars, Allied pilots spoke with a mix of disbelief and pride. On German radios, the first hints of doubt began to surface. The men who had once laughed now wanted to know what devil flew beneath the White Star insignia. Reports came in one after another. Large enemy aircraft, hard to bring down. High-speed dives, devastating firepower. And one phrase repeated across multiple reports, "The Thunderbolt doesn't fall." At the front lines, soldiers began giving it another name, Der Donner, the Thunder. German pilots learned to fear its sound even before they saw it. A deep, resonant roar that shook cockpits, an echo that came just before the fire. They knew that if they heard it too close, it was already too late. Meanwhile, at Allied bases, respect became devotion. Mechanics treated each P-47 as if it were a sacred animal. They spent hours in the rain, hands covered in grease, and when they finished, they would pat the fuselage, as one thanks a beast for returning alive. Some painted names on them: Juggernaut, Lady Godiva, Razorback. Others simply drew a white line for each mission completed. Among all the stories born from those missions, one became legend. Its hero was Robert S. Johnson, a young pilot of the 56 Fighter Group. On June 26, 1943, Johnson took off from England on a routine mission. He had no idea that flight would make him the living symbol of the impossible. The squadron flew over France when they were ambushed. German hunters descended from the clouds, and the sky became hell. Johnson was hit almost immediately. A 20-millimeter burst tore through his cockpit, punctured the fuel tank, and destroyed the hydraulic controls. His plane began spinning out of control, the windshield coated with oil and smoke. He tried to bail out, but the cockpit wouldn't budge. The bullets had sealed the metal frame. He pounded with fists, elbows, head. Nothing. He was trapped, and still falling. "I thought that was it," he would write later, but the engine kept roaring, as if the plane refused to die. Around him, Focke-Wulfs spiraled, firing endless bursts. The Thunderbolt's fuselage was perforated again and again. Bullets ricocheted inside the cockpit. Instruments exploded, glass shattered. But the steel monster stayed in the air. Johnson, covered in blood and sweat, pulled the stick once more. The plane shuddered, as if waking from a nightmare. It climbed slowly through the smoke. The Germans followed, incredulous. "That man can't still be flying," one shouted over the radio. "He's in pieces." But the Thunderbolt climbed higher. And when it seemed about to fall, the German pilot stopped, turned his plane, and flew away. Perhaps out of respect. Perhaps out of fear. Perhaps because he understood that you cannot kill what no longer fears death. Robert Johnson made it back to England. His plane was wrecked. Mechanics stopped counting bullet holes after 200. The propeller was chipped, the ailerons torn off, and yet it had crossed the channel. When he climbed out of the cockpit, a hush fell over the base. No one spoke, only the soft ping of cooling metal. Then one mechanic whispered, "This plane, it's made of something else." That night, in the barracks, the pilots gathered around Johnson. No drinks, no laughter, only listening. The young man described the moment he thought he would die, and how the plane had kept him alive. Not as a machine, but as a companion that refused to fall. "The Thunderbolt didn't fly with me," he said. "It carried me home." From that day forward, the myth of the indestructible aircraft spread across Europe. The Germans began avoiding direct confrontations. Orders were clear. Do not engage Thunderbolts unless necessary. A tacit acknowledgement that the sky had changed. The Thunder had not only proven its power, but its spirit. It was no longer a creation of metal and fuel. It was the embodiment of something deeper. Human will refusing to surrender. In a war where death was normal, resilience became a form of faith. Every time a P-47 returned to the ground, its skin riddled with wounds, men looked at it with the same mix of fear and gratitude reserved for a god who had descended from the sky. The Thunderbolt was born of steel, but its strength was not in the metal. Its true power lived in the hands that built it, and in the men who dared to fly it. In America, the factories never slept. Hangar lights blazed day and night like industrial temples. Every bolt, every valve, every rivet was the result of a collective effort. Women assembling wings with broken nails, young men working 16-hour shifts, engineers designing while standing, as the war consumed the world outside. The sky is won from the ground, one supervisor would say, and no one doubted it. Trains crisscrossed the country carrying wings and engines. Foundries roared like volcanoes, and the factories became the beating heart of a nation, determined not to yield a single inch of sky. That roar wasn't just the Pratt Whitney engine. It was the sound of millions of wills in perfect sync. The pilots knew it. That's why, before climbing into the Thunderbolt, many touched the fuselage with respect, as if greeting a living being. They knew it was not just another machine. It was their only companion between life and death. A silent pact between man and steel. You carry me into battle, they thought, and I'll bring you home. In the air, that bond became almost spiritual. The pilot and the machine breathed together, vibrated on the same frequency. Every turn, every burst, every maneuver was a wordless conversation between them. And when the enemy appeared on the horizon, it was no longer the man deciding. It was the thunder taking control. There was something poetic in that relationship. On the ground, the Thunderbolt was a clumsy giant, heavy, hard to move. But in the sky, it became pure grace, as if the air recognized it, as if gravity itself stepped aside to let it pass. Pilots said that once in flight, the plane seemed to have a soul. When the engine roared, the sound filled the cockpit like a heartbeat. It was not just any sound. It was a pulse, a reminder that inside that steel fortress there was life. It was as if it were breathing. A veteran would later recall, "When you felt that roar beneath your feet, you knew you were not alone up there." During breaks between missions, pilots would sit next to their machines. Some spoke to them quietly. Others cleaned them in silence, as if tending to a sleeping animal. Amid the horrors of war, these pieces of metal had become something more. Home, companionship, the only way to keep their sanity. Across the ocean, in industrial towns, families waited for letters that said little but said everything. Today, I came back with my plane. Today, it saved me again. It was their way of saying, I'm alive. The Thunderbolt did not just represent technological supremacy. It represented something much deeper, the union of human effort and faith in the impossible. Every time a pilot took off, he did so knowing that millions of hands held him from below, and every time he returned, those same hands touched the machine again, as if they, too, had flown. "It's not a plane," an engineer wrote in the margin of a technical manual. "It's proof that man can give a soul to metal." War had reduced the world to numbers, to casualties, to statistics, to strategies. But amid that chaos, these machines were reminders that there was still something human in combat. The Thunderbolt didn't just fire. It protected, it endured, and it brought home those who had already lost hope. And so, in that silent pact between man and machine, the new spirit of the sky was forged. A spirit that no longer belonged to a flag, but to the very idea of survival. Because in war, symbols change. First, they are weapons. Then they become myths. And the Thunderbolt, the Steel Thunder, was no longer just a plane. It was the embodiment of the human instinct to keep flying, even when the entire world is falling around you. The summer of 1944 had arrived, and the skies over Europe were no longer the same. Sunrises over France brought a different sound, deeper, heavier, as if the very atmosphere remembered who ruled it now. The Luftwaffe, once stretched across the continent, was exhausted. The old aces, heroes of the early years, had fallen or were on the brink of collapse. The new recruits barely knew how to fly. While Germany tried to build more planes, the enemy was already waiting with thousands. American factories sent over 500 Thunderbolts to the front each month. The sky was filled with thunder. By day and night, P-47s roared over the fields, escorting bombers, attacking trains, silencing anti-aircraft guns. Where German fighters once flew, now only trails of smoke and falling metal fragments remained. "The skies are full of them," a German soldier wrote to his wife. "When the sun rises, their shadows cover the fields. The noise feels like the earth itself is shaken. We no longer look up, we just wait for them to pass." The change was not immediate. It was gradual, relentless, like the advance of a storm no one could stop. The Germans continued to fight bravely, but every mission became more desperate. Every takeoff was a gamble, every return an exception. The Thunderbolt had become both judge and executioner of the sky. In its path, convoys scattered, tanks hid under trees, soldiers ran for cover. The thunder needed no announcement. Its roar alone froze the soul. "When you heard that sound," a German gunner would recall years later, "you knew death was near. There was no shelter, no way to escape." Railways, the lifeblood of the German army, began to be systematically destroyed. Thunderbolts dived from the sun with fury, firing rockets, strafing locomotives, and climbing again through columns of smoke and fire. Within weeks, the trains stopped moving, supplies failed to arrive, and the army began to starve before bullets could kill. Air supremacy was no longer an advantage. It was a sentence. During Operation Overlord in June 1944, the skies over Normandy were completely allied. Soldiers landing on the beaches looked up and saw hundreds of Thunderbolts crossing the sky like colossal birds. The roar of their engines was a sonic shield. "As I listened to the thunder," a Marine wrote, "I knew we were not alone." That day, Germany realized something that would change military history forever. And the sky was no longer a battlefield between men. It was a territory governed by industry, logistics, and collective will. The era of the lone pilot, the hero who won battles with elegant maneuvers, was over. The thunder marked the beginning of a new era. Massive power, inexhaustible steel, machinery that knew no fatigue. "The sky belongs to those who can keep it full," an Allied general said in front of a map covered in red lines. And in 1944, the only ones capable of doing so were the United States. The Germans launched the first jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me 262, but it was too late. Airfields were destroyed, pilots untrained, fuel scarce. Their machines were born already without hope. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts flew in formation over the ruins. Some German pilots watched from the ground, without even attempting to take off. They knew the fight was no longer between equals. They had lost not only the sky, but the faith that it could ever belong to them again. In the liberated French villages, children ran after the Allied fighters, lifting their gaze each time they heard the roar. For them, the sound of the Thunderbolt was not war, but freedom. And so, slowly, the sky changed owners. not with a single great battle, but with thousands of anonymous flights, with the consistency of an endless storm. By the end of summer, the few remaining German pilots knew the end was near. They no longer looked to the horizon for enemies. They looked at the sky and understood that what they had once believed theirs now belonged to someone else. "The sky no longer obeys us," wrote a German squadron commander. "We have become visitors in the place where we once ruled." The roar of the thunderbolt continued to echo over Europe, a reminder that even the most confident powers can lose everything when they forget that arrogance is the first form of defeat. When the war ended, the skies of Europe were left scarred with invisible wounds. Thousands of destroyed planes lay in abandoned fields, among tall grass and the echo of what once was the roar of the gods. Pilots returned home, but a part of them remained floating above, among clouds and smoke, in that realm where fear and glory blended. Thunderbolts were dismantled, melted down, recycled, forgotten. Some ended up in museums, others in scrap. Yet each one carried within a fragment of the spirit of those who flew them. When I walked to my P-47 for the last time, Robert S. Johnson would recall years later, I touched it silently. I didn't know if I was thanking it or saying goodbye. It was like saying farewell to a part of myself. In Germany, surviving pilots also remembered, not as enemies, but as men who had stared death from opposite sides of the sky. Many met years later, and upon seeing each other, they did not greet with reproach, but with respect, because only they knew what it was like to live with an engine roaring beneath your chest, feeling that life could end in any second. When the thunderbolts arrived, a German veteran said, "We understood that the war had changed. They were not just planes, they were a message. They taught us that the sky does not belong to the one who fires first, but to the one who endures the longest." That was the true triumph of the Thunderbolt. It did not just shoot down planes, it humbled pride itself. It reminded everyone that power without humility becomes nothing but empty noise. Today, decades later, some of those old planes still fly in exhibitions. Their engines roar as if time does not exist. People watch and applaud, unaware they are witnessing a reflection of an era where each flight could have been the last. And as they cross the sky, generations who never knew war pause for a moment to listen. Because even though history has changed, the thunder still says this: courage does not always mean attacking, but standing firm when everything else collapses. The day German pilots discovered the sky no longer belonged to them, history says, was not just the day they lost a battle. It was the day they understood what it truly means to fly. For flying, in its purest sense, has never been escaping the earth, but facing the gravity of existence with the certainty that, even so, you can rise. The metal thunder may have quieted decades ago, but its echo remains alive in the wind.